Welcome to my DEATHcon workshop for 2023, Practical Death by Velociraptor. First of all, about me, my name's Matt. I work at Rapid7 with Velociraptor a lot. I kind of do DFIR and researchy stuff. And I guess my claim to fame is I'm an early Velociraptor. I was an early Velociraptor adopter. And I have a lot of experience with kind of consulting IR deployments with Velociraptor. That's not actually a picture of me, but rather a bad joke of a 90s sitcom. The agenda for today, or for these sessions, is we're going to cover off some background like we do with a lot of Velociraptor stuff. We're going to cover off a little bit on VQL and accesses and do some labs around that. We're going to talk about performance and best practice, and then we're going to cover some labs around niche detection use cases that I think are pretty good. For people that know Velociraptor, you can probably skip down to the performance side, but for people that are new, feel free to start from the beginning and go slowly. I think it will give you a good kind of groundwork in how to use Velociraptor for detection and threat hunting use cases. But I have left bits out. So I would recommend people who are new to go back to some of our training that's available on the documentation sites. And that should give you probably a better rundown of Velociraptor in general. I'm thinking specifically for detection use cases and specifically for more DFIR as well. The prerequisites for our labs, essentially you need a Windows 10 and above VM with administrator access. I have some labs on Black Lotus, which will need UEFI set up, and I'll have steps on how to do that in the labs. So if the VM you're using isn't UEFI, essentially you can build a second pretty quickly, and I'll give you instructions for kind of what you need to do in VMware and that kind of stuff. You'll need internet access if you want to do like content management, and some of the labs actually pull down things from the internet as well. So you will definitely need internet access to do those unless you want to just watch the video. The Velociraptor binary, we're using version 7-3, and you can obtain that from the Velociraptor repo in the releases page. And you'll find a lot of the labs will have either links or a QR code like this. And what that QR code on the screen will do is it will push us through to kind of like a landing page that will have a list of the videos and all the available labs for DEATHcon, and you can kind of move at your own pace. It's kind of up to you. So first of all, what is Velociraptor? Velociraptor is an open source kind of DFIR tool, obviously. I think it's best used for forensics and doing that at scale and fast, like that point at the bottom says. But we can also do things like monitoring and response work with it. What drives Velociraptor is a query language that, funnily enough, is called Velociraptor Query Language. And VQL is used essentially to store knowledge. And we have a term called artifacts that is a store of this DFIR knowledge that lets you apply it very easily, able to share it and expand various use cases in the DFIR world effectively. Velociraptor is kind of famous for its really simple architecture, and we have a single binary that has the server and client components built in. And I'm going to work through some of the other use cases in the next few slides around how you can use Velociraptor, which people who are new might find interesting. The Velociraptor kind of architecture is really simple. Simple server client setup, like you can see here, and you access the server by a web console and essentially request on the server to do collections on all your assets, so on and so forth. So really simple architecture. But the use cases that we have from a death standpoint are your traditional DFIR, kind of IR scoping or hunting, looking at like volatile data points or static data points on the disk. but we can also do telemetry collection. And in Velociraptor, we focus on Sysmon, but we do like novel ETW collections as well. And it's really up to the user what they want to deploy. Most of this workshop is focusing on the top bullet point. Telemetry, I don't think is Velociraptor's strong point at the moment, but I do plan on working on that a little bit more, and we are starting to look at it. If people who follow the project may have noticed that Mike has recently done pull requests for Sigma and native Sigma conversion. So we're starting to think about how we can apply like industry standard rules to things like telemetry, to things like event logs, to give us a better capability there as well. The third use case I have here is third-party tools, and that goes to the expandability of Velociraptor, the ability to shell out and run things that you might be interested in. The use case that I think of here is something like Hollows Hunter or auto runs in Windows. I just put up a knock artifact for macOS. So we have the capability to shell out, and it really depends on what you're trying to do. Do you want to, say, spend the time to build native content, or is shelling out okay? It's really up to the users. So talking about deployments, like you can see, the most common deployment is server client, and this is typically how I think about Velociraptor for most of my experience and use case. We have support for pretty much all OSs. Velociraptor is written in Golang, so obviously the OS needs to support that. And you find that even in some of the older OSs, say, for example, 32-bit Windows, the limitation may be it just doesn't have some of the collections or some of the plugins that are available to the 64-bit version. So limitations are mainly Go-based, and depending on like the function or the plugin capability itself. We have things like mitigations around performance, and I'll touch upon this later when we do the performance section. But keep in mind the server is optimized for kind of doing things remotely at scale. Mike Cohen is the main author of Velociraptor, and he essentially was a developer on GUI. So a lot of the Velociraptor core features and ideas come from some of the pain that was felt in the GUI project. So as you can see on the screen, typical deployments are 10 to 15K, maybe up to 20K would be the limit that we'd have a single server set up. We can deploy multiple front ends if we need to. And we've seen up to 150,000 endpoints with a multi-front end setup. But it really depends on the environment. Most of the engagements that I see are never above 20,000. 20,000 would be a really big one. But the resources on the server side are fairly low for even up that high. You can see 8 gigs RAM, 8 cores is pretty generous at the top end of the range. When you're talking about performance of the server, a big part of that is TLS or SSL connections. So if you can offload that, that's going to give you a big performance bump. And that would be a recommendation if people are looking at, say, using something like reverse proxy. You can see here I've got a QR code. If you follow that, that will take you to the Velociraptor documentation, to the deployment screen, and that will give you a good overview of deployments and how to set various use cases up and help you win in terms of deployments. So the second main use case I wanted to share that can be death-orientated is offline collector. Now, a typical offline collection use case would be like a live response collection where you give someone a binary, they run it, and then it would just collect all of their live response items. It can also be used from a detection standpoint. So I've configured an offline collector with a bunch of ISEs and then given it to a customer as like a scanning tool, and that worked really well. Essentially, because Velociraptor is an all-in-one binary, you can configure it to run preset artifacts or preset things, and then when it's clicked, it will run those things. It will then output to an archive file, and you can say send it up to a cloud storage or SFTP site and do a level of preservation from that approach. The final kind of mode of running, and this is kind of what we're going to run through in all of our pracs, GUI mode. And GUI mode is essentially the same as client server, but everything is local. So you have all the features that the server has, but it's local and pointing back to the loopback address. It's really good for doing detection and analysis work, and it's pretty much where I live when I do a lot of analysis, and you'll kind of see that today. And this is why I kept most of the labs to a kind of like a single VM workshop approach, right? And it helps you understand not only how you can work from a like detection lab viewpoint, but also how you can do a lot of dev for artifacts and things like that. Okay, so first up, we're going to do a lab, and that will be how you can run and set up GUI mode. Okay, so we're going to walk through setting up GUI mode right now. So to start, we need to go to the Velociraptor GitHub repo. I'll just walk back to kind of show you. So the GitHub repo, on the right-hand side, we've got the releases page. So if we click on that, it will bring up, you can see at the top, we've got like a README of the latest release information. But we want to click down into the assets and look for the latest Windows binary. So in this case, it's -3 and this AMD 64-bit version. And while that's downloading, we'll open up a command prompt and run as administrator. And I'll walk through some of the kind of commands to run. So essentially we run to cd, we go to your desktop, and then we want to copy across to, and I'm changing to velociraptor.exe, so the commands will work for other versions if people are running this later on with a later version or even earlier version, whatever. And what I want to do first is just run Velociraptor. And when you run it like this, you'll see you just get like an output of help and all of the relevant switches that you might be interested in running. And this is actually a really handy troubleshooting methodology, or if you're not kind of sure what to run. So if we type in Velociraptor GUI, we can type in help as well, and then we'll get the help specific to that feature. So the thing that I wanted to point out in GUI mode is this data store entry. And essentially what that will do is kind of let you configure where you want to store all of your data for persistent use. And this is really helpful when you're doing like detection or content development, because it means you're not going to lose any data. What Velociraptor does by default is it will use your temp folder, and that will persist. But the problem is you might find Windows might randomly purge your temp data, and it will probably be during the middle of a really important thing that you're doing. So I always recommend to configure this data store as you go. The other switch I recommend is using -V, and what that will do is run in verbose mode, which is another troubleshooting step that will give you kind of like, you can see on the screen, things that it's running, you can see. So if there's any errors, or if you need to troubleshoot like what your Velociraptor is doing at the time, you can literally see it on the screen. Now, one thing that hasn't happened is the Velociraptor GUI hasn't popped up, and that's actually a bug in Windows 11. So if you're running Windows 11, what you'll need to do is come to your browser, and it's a bug in Edge. Edge isn't configured to defaultly pop up the Velociraptor GUI. If you're running Chrome or running Windows 10, it will pop up by default, but it's no worries. We can just get there by going to loopback address port 8889, and we simply bounce through the warning, and the username is admin, and the password is password. And this is just local GUI mode, so security is not too relevant here for username and password, but that will get you into the GUI. So what I wanted to show in the GUI was, first of all, the left-hand side, you have your menu of items. And this documentation page, you can see at the bottom, it takes you to docs.velociraptor.app. And I've got that open here, which is super handy. And some of the QR codes I linked to this documentation section, which has information on the install and other various troubleshooting things. Other useful items are the training, to get maybe another training video to see how Velociraptor works, but also this reference. And this is really useful to search when you're, say, trying to write artifacts and figure out kind of what functions to use and whatnot. The other interesting thing is knowledge base and artifact exchange, and I'll cover that a bit later, so we'll jump back into the demo now. What we're going to cover first is up here you have a search item, and you'll probably use this a lot if you're using Velociraptor. In local mode, I mentioned before, we've got like a local client and server on the same box, and this is the client. So typically in engagement, you might search for the host name, or you could search for a label that you're interested in by doing like label and then this string. But in this case, we can click on our host, and this is like a summary data of this machine. You can see here we have the option to add a label, which is kind of useful. Some people will run like automation of labels and do things like maybe run like a live response triage, or run other workflows, or maybe put the status of the machine in here, like compromised or clean or whatever might be relevant to the case. One thing that I do labels for is use things like label DCs and other critical servers that I might want to run specific content for. We have the option of using quarantine, but that's another lab session that's quite complex. Collected to run collections, we'll get to that a bit later, but what I wanted to cover off first with this was this VFS view. And now VFS stands for Virtual File System, and essentially you can see on the left-hand side, we have our sections. The top one, it's auto, but this is file system view. And this is essentially using the Windows API. So if you think of accesses that we talked about later, we're using the file accessor here. And you can see we've got visibility of the disk, right? So this is very similar to what you'd see if you're browsing using Explorer down there. You'd be able to see what's on the disk. We have NTFS here. And if you note the difference when this expands out, it will have all of the NTFS special files visible as well. And this is different in that it's using the NTFS accessor to give us visibility to those special files. So you can see, we can see the MFT, we can see metadata on it. And what this is doing is it's actually parsing the MFT to present this to us. So it's not relying on the Windows API, which is kind of cool. I'll drill down here and we'll keep going. And typically what you can see, I'm clicking on this refresh button to kind of go the next level. People might find that a bit tedious. So what we have is this recursive button, which will essentially let you recurse down and collect all the lower items as well. I don't like doing it at top levels because you can potentially like spin your wheels a bit and wait a while. I like to drill in a bit to do it. But when you do that, you can browse down and jump down to what you need pretty quickly. What I wanted to show though was, if we come back here, expand this out using like filters. So let's go to ntuser.dat. If I can type ntuser.dat. And then when we filter down, we can kind of see the file there. You can see it's got the metadata and timestamps associated, which is kind of cool and helpful from a triage perspective. And this view is kind of like a typical forensic tool. But when I collect from client, you can see it calculates the hash of the file, but it also gives us this really nice preview view, which lets us view in like a hex kind of style. So I can go to an offset. You can see I'm at offset 909. There's nothing interesting there. Or I can maybe search for a string. And in this case, I'll search for PowerShell. It's always going to be in registry. And you can see it's found all the relevant PowerShell things. Interestingly, we can search on regex, string, or hex. So it's kind of useful for that triage if you are just having a quick pop at a file. The other thing I wanted to cover off was registry, and just like file, the registry accessor gives us visibility into the registry, funnily enough. I'll do the same thing here. This is all new data. So this is happening live and in real time. So it gives you an idea for the performance. Personally, like I don't like using this view. I am like old school in that like I'd rather write some VQL and do a collection to scope this stuff. But some people like to use this, so it's always good to show other ways of doing things. So I'll just recursively go down from here, and we should be able to get to a specific key. So we're just looking at registry keys right now, and then when I click on one, you can see the actual key value down here. So this is a string, and that's the string name. So it's kind of cool, and you can collect that. You can see, so typically like a forensic kind of use case. What I wanted to touch on now was the collection side of things. So if we go back to our client, at the top, we have this collected view. And if I click on there, I may have said during the initial intro that everything in VQL everything in Velociraptor is VQL. And you can see actually all of the collections that we have here were our VFS walks. That essentially they're just VQL collections on the machine. It's just they're presented to you in a different way, and you can kind of see the results that we're working through. And that's it, right? To add a new collection, we just hit the little plus button there, and then let me use prefetch, and you can select what artifacts you want to use. I'll just select one, and it will have a description, give you an idea of the VQL that's visible, and then enable you to do things like configure parameters and whatnot down there. When you are running collections, you can specify resources, and we'll get to this a little bit later in terms of the best practices for this stuff. But when I hit launch, it will go away and run. And you'll see the results returned here. We'll have information here, the artifact collection, in terms of things like duration, when it started, other metadata about the hunt, as well as the total rows, which are interesting. This button here lets us prepare download, and then that will kind of generate a zip file, and then we can extract the data. So this is kind of useful for when you're maybe collecting something that you want to do analysis somewhere else. You can pull out CSV of that or JSON of that and take your analysis elsewhere. It will also kind of enable you to download uploaded files and things if you've uploaded files in your collection. But the other place to upload files is here. Now, I don't have one, but it will just be a single file you can download. And it's kind of really up to you what you want to do. I usually just click here unless there's like hundreds of files, in which case I'll download the bunch and then process them elsewhere. The other thing we've touched on, results, logs will give you log, obviously, but notebook here, which is really good. Notebook allows us to munge data, where we can do things like add where clauses. We'll cover this off a little bit later, but it's just good to know that this is a notebook that's associated to this collection only. Later on, I'll show you the notebook in the server, which is kind of like a server notebook, so a higher level notebook for us, and there is a differentiation there. The next thing I wanted to show was artifacts. So you probably saw me search on the prefetch and be able to find that pretty effectively, but this view here is our view artifacts. And this will be somewhere I think that you live if you're looking at developing content or looking at using content. The secret to Velociraptor is kind of knowing what to search for and what keywords. And you can see here we've got kind of like a limiter that will let us target specific types of artifacts. But using our example I used before, searching prefetch, what this will do is this is a regex, and this will go through all of the name of artifacts, but also the description, and then return artifacts that it thinks are relevant to you. It is actually regex, so we can do like a type, and then maybe we can do MFT, or we can do detection.yara to get all of our Yara detection artifacts up. But it's really easy to find content here. And most importantly, using keywords to kind of find something that's similar to what you want to write. And then you can modify it to your use case, which is super, super useful. Okay, so like the other thing I wanted to talk about was notebook. We're not going to be covering monitoring. We don't need to cover users and things here, and permissions and stuff like other kind of server-y stuff. But where we're going to live a lot is this notebook, and this is think of it as the server notebook. So here you can add description, share with all users. In our use case here, we don't have any other users, so we don't need to worry about that. But once you create a notebook, you can then add a new item. So that item could be Markdown for presentation, or it could be VQL. You can add some other special things that aren't really relevant. A lot of artifacts will have these suggestions, but here we don't, because we've got the server notebook. And then you can just write your VQL here and see the results, right? This is a server artifact, but say you wanted to run the prefetch artifact we did. What was it? Forensics. You can call artifacts and things here. And this is probably the important thing to call out is when we run this in this server level, it won't work this way if you're actually on a real server. When you're in GUI mode, because it's looking at the local loopback address, the server has, it can respond to collecting the prefetch artifact because it does have prefetch. If you're running this on a Linux server or like an actual server client setup, you may not be able to run this, and you'd need to run a function called collect client, which effectively tells the server to go and schedule a collection on the endpoint. So it's worth differentiating for that. It's not really relevant for our lab, but just understand the difference between a server and a client collection, and know that we're kind of breaking the laws of gravity by using this in GUI mode. Okay, so the next kind of section I wanted to show was importing content. And I showed you the collection on the client side, but we can also run that on the server side too, right? And very similar view here. First of all, we click on this left-hand side, server artifacts, but we just hit plus for a new collection. And in this case, what I'm going to do is import the artifact exchange. And what the artifact exchange is essentially this Velociraptor repo. We have a community repo that people can add content to. And it's just like the built-in content, but it's a little bit less vetted. There might be bits that don't work completely. We try to keep it up to date, but it's kind of best effort. It may not be at the same level. There's no tests and things like that happen on it. But again, you can kind of search here for keywords that you're interested in. So let's look at UEFI. I know there's stuff here because I was working on it before. We have a whole bunch of artifacts related there that we might be interested in specifically using. But back to Velociraptor, in the server collection or server artifact section, we just select artifact exchange. You can read about what it's doing. And essentially what it's doing is it's downloading from a URL. It's then taking the zip file and extracting the YAML files from it. And then it's using a function called artifact set to add the definitions of what's in those zip file definitions. When we select this guy, we can jump through and, like I said before, we've got the URL here. You can point this at another place if you want. You add a prefix that you want. And then when you launch it, it will go out, pull down that zip file and install the content. You can see this running. And then we've got the summary of the content that's been imported. What I'd like to do is jump back to the artifacts. And what you can see here is if we search on Exchange, all of those artifacts are in there. And it's not just client artifacts, but we've got server artifacts too. We've got a whole bunch of different artifacts that now we have expanded Velociraptor to use. And this is kind of what I do internally, and what lots of other users use is they will configure their Velociraptor servers to suck down Velociraptor artifacts for them that they'll use during engagements and things like that. What I want to do is run another one that I have, and there's actually an artifact in the artifact exchange called, I need to go to server artifacts though, called import DEATHcon. And this is a GitHub repo that I run. And it's actually using a very similar methodology to importing from the artifact exchange. Except it's using a URI, a release page URI, and then I do some kind of test to make sure it's the latest version and all this stuff. But very similar methodology. The prefix I'm using here is DEATHcon. And we'll bounce through that. There'll be less that's installed. But hopefully it's given you an idea of some of the things that we can do in terms of importing content and keeping yourself up to date. We will be using some of the content that we've just imported, which is kind of cool. And similarly, if we come here, we can see DEATHcon. There's a whole bunch of content in there too. So that concludes our lab for section 1. Have a play and use Velociraptor, and feel free to ask any questions if you need any help. Thank you.